Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Next year will mark 100 years since the first election at which compulsory voting was introduced. Whether you agree with it or not, compulsory voting has had a major influence on the way political parties campaign to win your vote. Joining me to discuss the history of compulsory voting and its impact on grassroots campaigning in Australia is historian Dr Chris Monnox. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Chris.
Okay, thanks Georgina, and thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you on. And 100 years it's been. This year is 100 years since the legislation was introduced, wasn't it, to have compulsory voting in Australia?
Yep, 100 years since the federal legislation, and next year will be the 100th anniversary of our first federal election with compulsory voting.
Is it still relatively rare, compulsory voting around the world?
Yes, it's rare, unusual to have compulsory voting on the books, and even more unusual to have it on the books and enforced.
That's interesting. Yes, of course, the fine. I mean, it's not a huge fine, but it's still there, and it's always unpleasant to get a fine for whatever reason. And people's views on compulsory voting are still to this day very divided in Australia. But what were the arguments in favour of compulsory voting in 1924 that were being discussed?
There were a lot, and it's interesting because historians haven't really been able to identify this one big standout argument that really won the day for compulsory voting. So there were people who made a more philosophical case. They said things like the government needs to have the confidence of the majority of the people, not just the majority of the people who showed up. There were people who talked about it as a way to improving people's engagement with the political system. But you also had these much more practical arguments. One of the big ones there was politicians and parties did not like how much time and money they were having to spend arranging transport, in particular arranging cars to bring people to the polls on polling day.
Right, which, okay, is understandable, but still that's a lot of self-interest there. So, it's a bit inconvenient for us political party. So we'll just make everyone vote and give them no choice.
Yep, that certainly was it. You did also get these arguments, that having people say things like, I'm not going to come and vote unless I get a ride in a car, that it detracted from the dignity of the occasion. But yes, you're right, there certainly was a lot of self-interest involved in this. And
was there a campaign against the introduction of compulsory voting? I mean, was it a big issue?
No. One of the real standouts when you're researching it, there's very weak pushback. I mean, it's not a partisan thing when it comes in federally. That's something there's Labor people who support it, there's nationalist country party people who support it, and you just don't see a lot of that principled argument about this is an infringement on civil liberties. It's part of that very utilitarian Australian political culture.
Yes, and you can imagine in a different country, say the United States, that those tendencies towards civil liberties and libertarianism would have been much stronger than in Australia, where there is that pragmatism.
Yeah, it's very hard to imagine it flying in the United States, and probably even Britain at the time, you would have seen a lot more pushback. But Australia did have this very pragmatic, don't worry about it if it works, political culture in the 1920s. And yeah, the libertarian case against was generally very weak.
So, Chris, election campaigning prior to 1925, can you describe what it was like? I mean, you've made reference to political parties driving voters in cars to booths, but can you paint a picture of what the political parties were doing to try and win votes and win elections?
Yeah, very heavily focused on getting out the vote and what we would now call voter ID. So standard campaign on the ground would start with the volunteers and party workers going around door-knocking people, can we rely on your support this time, etc. They would get a copy of the electoral roll, mark that up with all the Labor supporters, all the Nationalist supporters and so on. Come election day, they'd have people standing outside all the polling booths with marked up copies of the electoral roll. People came in to vote. They'd say, well, check you off the roll. And generally in the afternoon, often around 3 p.m, they'd have a look. Who are our supporters who haven't turned out yet? And they would send out cars, carriages, etc., to try and find these people, try and pick them up, get them to come and vote.
So it's interesting, the way you describe it, it doesn't sound like there was much effort put into persuading someone to vote for your party. You are a Labor voter or a Nationalist voter or a Country Party voter. That's been identified. And now we're going to try and work out how to actually get you to the ballot box to vote.
Yep, persuasion, very much a secondary concern on the ground. You, of course, still had campaigning in the media. You had politicians, you had candidates would spend a lot of time giving speeches at public meetings and the like. But that on-the-ground campaigning, no, very much about getting out the vote. Of course, the conversations would happen. People would have a chat about policy. There was nothing to stop that happening, but it wasn't the point.
And what sort of materials are left over from this period? Are there interesting campaign flyers or records of political parties, maybe lists of, well, Joe Blow lives on this street and this is the car that's allocated to pick him up? Is that what you find in the records?
Yes, but they're not all in one place. There's no equivalent to if you're researching the 50s or the 70s. You can go to the National Library. They'll have the Liberal papers and the Labor papers, about 600 archive boxes apiece. There's no equivalent to those huge collections. So you have to go through individual politicians' papers. There might be a couple of folders. The material's there, but it takes a lot of piecing together.
And what is the material that's left?
There's branch records, certainly correspondence between politicians and their organisers, correspondence between politicians and each other, things like flyers and pamphlets.
And what are the flyers and pamphlets? Is there much around the policies, around the candidates, around the leaders, or is it more just vote?
If we're talking about the 1910s, 1920s, the pamphlets are quite policy-focused, and a lot of them are quite wordy. You wouldn't see something like that put out in an election today. A lot of them are targeted at particular groups. So you'll have pamphlets specifically addressed to women, a pamphlet specifically addressed to returned servicemen, a lot for farmers, and not that many about the local candidate. You'd get a few, but most of the flyers were centrally produced by the state party officers, so they weren't about the local guy. They were about themes that would play everywhere, or at least in a lot of different electorates.
And tell me, Chris, what about the weather conditions on polling day? Because this is something I've observed, say, in the UK or the US when they have an election. It's, it's terrible snowstorm or terrible rain or really, really hot, and that's going to impact whether people turn out or not. Whereas in Australia, I think there's always a bit of slight commentary around the edges with this, but I don't think it makes statistically significant difference on the number of people who actually turn out to vote, given it is compulsory.
Oh, they worried a lot about the weather. There was a very wet election day in Victoria in 1913, and the parties, they worried it would depress turnout. It doesn't actually seem to, but they did worry about it. There was also this controversy in 1919 and 1922. This is, of course, when the Country Party is just starting up. And there is this suspicion that Billy Hughes has called elections in December because that is during the wheat harvest, and he does not want the farmers to turn out. So, yes, they worried about the weather, and they also thought things were open to a certain amount of gamesmanship.
I assume that was the Country Party who was worried about Billy Hughes calling an election during the harvest. Were their concerns well-founded?
Well, for them, no. They did well at both those elections.
Oh, sorry.
Particularly
the farmers put down their harvesting equipment and still voted then, obviously.
It would seem so, but in 1922 there was very low turnout across the board. not just in the country, also in the city. So turnout during the 1910s was between 70 and 80%, so quite good. These systems for getting out the vote worked quite well. And then in 1922, for reasons historians haven't really been able to clearly identify, turnout just plummets to 58%.
Wow, that's quite a decline. And you can't discern, was it the issues weren't really of much interest, or was it economic conditions, or was it a fait accompli, the outcome, so people thought, I'm not going to really make a difference either way?
It might have been the issues. There weren't really any burning issues at this election. It might have been that the outcome wasn't seen as that competitive. Labor's not doing very well at all in the early 20s. It might have been election fatigue. Australia had 5 federal elections in the 1910s. But yeah, we're not really sure just what it was. But it was a big factor behind compulsory voting coming in 1924.
It's interesting, though, in 1922 at this election when, as you say, the national turnout was just 58%. The state of Queensland, though, bucked that trend, didn't it?
Oh, yes. So Queensland had compulsory voting since 1914. Queensland was really the pioneer in this respect. And yes, state elections turnout in Queensland starts reliably being about 80%, and that does transfer over into federal elections. So Queensland seats in 1922, turnout is 83%. So if you're looking at the rest of the country, it would actually be even lower, 58%.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. And do you think that's because people were used to voting because of the compulsory nature of voting at the state election? So when it was a federal election, they didn't necessarily think that they were that different and just followed the habit?
That is the most obvious explanation there. I mean, there was nothing particularly compelling about 1922 in Queensland. It was just compulsory voting is habit forming. I think that's a large part of its success in Australia, actually. It's habit forming.
It's said that Labor in this period was the better organised party, and I guess the connection to the trade union movement gave it a connection to organised groups as opposed to the Country Party or the Nationalists at the time. So the movement towards compulsory voting then starts to remove that advantage of very organised parties, doesn't it? I mean, the party that's most organised, that knows where its supporters are located and lived and has enough cars to drive around and pick up voters and get them to the polling booth, is perhaps the party that ends up winning. Was there concerns in Labor ranks about the introduction of compulsory voting that might remove its organisational advantage?
That's the conventional wisdom in the 1910s, particularly the Liberals, but people in general have this idea that, Labor is the more organised party. You hear a lot about Labor being the party machine. These guys know how to organise, they know how to get out the vote, so compulsory voting is a way of counteracting their influence. It was a non-Labor government that introduced compulsory voting in Queensland, but Labor then won the next few Queensland elections. And so by the early 1920s, there's real doubts about this idea. You still see some people saying Labor is the better organised party. The stay-at-homes are mostly Liberal or Nationalist supporters. But that's not really the consensus in any party by this point.
So who was the Prime Minister who introduces compulsory voting in 1924?
That's Stanley Bruce. And he, interestingly enough, is one of these people who's willing to say, I don't know who this will benefit. Not just in public either. There's private correspondence where he says, okay, this might make some very safe Labor seats a bit less safe, but beyond that, no, I don't know who this will benefit.
Well, and of course, him saying that publicly, not least privately, but at least the Prime Minister saying that publicly, of course, contributes to that sense that it's a non-partisan issue. This is an issue relating to a democratic system rather than favouring one group or the other.
Yeah, by 1924, it's one of these things where everybody in politics has some take about what the likely effects are going to be, who it's going to benefit, but they're not on party lines. So there's Labor people who think this will benefit them. There's nationalist people who think, no, it will actually benefit them in the safe Labor seats where nationalist voters tend to stay home.
Yeah, it's interesting that in the end, Stanley Bruce was right in a way. It didn't really seem to benefit one or the other. People just voted as they had voted before.
Yeah, the 1925 election, it's not close. It's a very convincing nationalist win. So there's not much of an argument then that this might have gone the other way were it not for compulsory voting. And then you have Labor keeps winning elections in Queensland. So certainly by the end of the 20s, there's very much a sense this is not something that's obviously helping one party.
Tell me, that first election, Chris, so it's compulsory voting, the parties know this. Did it change how they spent their election funds? Did it change how they campaigned? Did they modify anything at all?
That first election and the next couple after that, they change surprisingly little because no one wants to be the experiment. No one wants to be the candidate who loses their seat by 1 or 2%. So they keep doing this in very much the old-fashioned for at least a couple of elections after compulsory voting. And the old get-out-the-vote method, sending cards for people, that doesn't really die out until the 40s, although you can see it's declining. It's becoming less important from the late 20s. So it's this very incremental.
And what's the change from that 22 election where only 58% of the voting population voted versus that 25 election once compulsory voting was in force?
Once compulsory voting comes in, turnout in federal elections is pretty consistently over 90%.
Wow. Okay.
So it works very well. It works better than it had in Queensland, and it meets the expectations of the most optimistic people. I mean, the chief electoral officer at the time, a bloke called J.D. Farrer, he's saying, yep, we're going to have 90% turnout. This is going to work very well. But there's a lot of doubt how compulsory is this. And yeah, it lives up to the most optimistic expectations.
And in terms of the Get Out the Vote campaign, it takes about 2 or 3 elections to really see that phase out?
You start seeing a decline after a few elections. There's not that emphasis on we must have as many cars as possible. This idea. It's not considered one of the most important things like it was in the 1910s by the end of the 20s. But people are still doing it into the 40s.
Into the 40s, even though they're seeing over 90% of voters or electors vote, they're still worried that if they don't, that might change.
It's scaling down, but electioneering can be a very traditionalist thing. And there is always that worry. What happens if you take a risk? What happens if you don't do it? You don't want to be out-organised if there's only 1% in it.
Do you think that Australian grassroots political campaigning then was quite conservative? It wasn't adopting radical, innovative techniques. People were just doing what they'd done for generations and not really moving towards experimenting or try and run a persuasion campaign rather than a vote mobilisation campaign, despite the fact that the law would warrant you doing so.
There were certainly experiments, and you do start to see people in some seats moving towards persuasion, moving towards candidates door knocking, which is something they didn't really do when it was get out the vote. But you mostly see that in non-incumbent seats. So they have more of an incentive to innovate. And yes, there is a lot of conservatism, not least because candidates in state seats tend to stay in Parliament for decades.
So this idea of the non-incumbent, so the challenger being more experimental, were you seeing many seats change hands or, as you say, people in state politics, for example, who were in the same seat for just years and years and years, so there wasn't really much changeover of seats and therefore the incumbents didn't have much incentive to change what they were doing in terms of campaigning?
You saw a lot of turnover in 1922, which is partly to do with the Country Party coming in, and a lot in 1929 and 1931, which had the huge swings to Labor, the United Australia Party in 31. But yeah, you do have these safe seats where there's not much incentive to change how you do things.
It's said by commentators that compulsory voting means Australian politics is forward in the middle, in the centre, not at the extremes like other countries it might be. Is that how you saw it develop through that late 20s, 30s, 40s? Were the arguments around policies being driven towards the centre, or were you still seeing the vestiges of that entrenched extreme positions on either end being fought out there?
Politics in the 1920s in Australia did tend to be quite centrist, but it's hard to point to compulsory voting and say that's why. There's also this factor of, exhaustion after those very divisive conscription debates. In the 1910s, there's a relatively benign economic climate. So you do have a fairly centrist politics in the 20s, but there's a lot of things working for that, not just compulsory voting.
So tell me about the move towards more persuasive campaigning, appealing to either the candidate or the policies or political ideology of a political party. How does that develop, Chris?
One of the first reactions you see from the parties when compulsory voting does come in is they're dealing with a bigger electorate. They see a lot of these people as very disengaged. So the first response isn't necessarily to get more persuasive. It's just to try and broadcast that message more widely. This is when you see parties adopting practices like putting a loudspeaker on top of a car, driving around a neighbourhood with someone shouting out, "Vote for X."
I am so pleased those days are behind us. It must have been so annoying. I lived in Japan, Chris, for many years, and I actually used to monitor Japanese domestic politics as part of my job. And I would go around and watch politicians campaign, and they still do that in Japan to this very day. They drive around in back of what we call a ute, pickup truck for American listeners, with the politicians standing in the open tray shouting out their policies with the loudspeaker, and it's just cacophonous.
You would think it would put people off if they did it outside my house. I would certainly not be inclined to vote for them. But the thinking was there's this huge new electorate. These people are disengaged. They're not coming to public meetings. Driving around and literally shouting through their windows is the only way we're going to get them. Then you see by the 30s, you're sort of seeing a bit more of a sophisticated approach. You're seeing more candidates start to door knock on their own behalf. That's not something they really did in the 1910s. Trying to have personal conversations, trying to persuade these unattached voters.
And Chris, this idea that you were saying the electorates are bigger and Australia in this era was becoming more suburban too, which is quite an interesting phenomenon. So you're seeing the rise of the Melbourne suburbs, the Sydney suburbs and the like. And so with suburbia growing, it's suburban sprawl, you're seeing people more in their own houses rather than out in the community. So the amplification of the loudhailer, the megaphone, that's actually a way of trying to get into their houses when otherwise these people inside might not otherwise hear you.
Amplification and going door to door, trying to have those conversations, it's all very strongly associated with these suburban electorates, and you are getting more of them into the 20s, into the 30s. They're very much geared for that environment. The inner city seats, for a start, they're just not very contested. They're mostly very safe Labor seats. People in the country, there's this feeling that people in the country are more inclined to go to the old-fashioned election meeting, listen to a speaker. The suburban voter really becomes this person who the parties were worried about, who the parties considered hard to reach.
And this person in previous elections might have, before compulsory voting, might not have voted at all, perhaps, and now they had to vote, but then how do you get into their ear and their face to persuade them of your party's message is the critical challenge. And I would argue it's still a challenge to this day, trying to convince the disengaged voter. But the public meeting, Now, I always thought of the 40s and 50s being the era of the town hall meeting when people actually would go along to the local town hall or street corner and listen to a politician deliver a lengthy policy speech. But it's interesting that even in the 1930s, one Conservative activist was saying that public meetings were going to join the stagecoaches, log fires and fancy waistcoats of our fathers within 10 years. So there was a sense that public meetings were becoming less important as a way to get people to vote for one party or the other.
Yeah, public meeting attendance fluctuates, but you do, even in 1922, the public meetings are not well attended. And they're not well attended right through the 30s. And so, yeah, you get this commentary that, no, the public meeting is dying off. This is, of course, radio is also coming in, so get some of the same narrative that you got in the 60s and 70s with TV. People would rather listen to the radio than go to a public meeting. And they have a revival in 1946 and 1949. People are very highly engaged in those elections. This is planning versus free enterprise. But the 30s elections don't engage people like that. There's a lot of doubts about the future of the public meeting.
And, of course, Australia not only has compulsory voting, we also have preferential voting, and that can be quite complicated for people. So if you had in, say, 1922 been one of the many people who didn't vote and maybe you've never voted, and then 1925 you're being told you have to vote, it's compulsory now, was there a level of lack of awareness of the way you should vote, and that might have translated into very high levels of informal votes?
That's what the parties thought, quite reasonably. That's what they thought would happen. They thought we're going to have all these people who haven't taken an interest in politics before, haven't used our quite complicated electoral system before. In Britain, of course, it's just an exit box, much more complicated here. And so, yeah, they expect informal voting to skyrocket. And there's this real effort by parties in the late 20s to educate people on how to cast a valid vote. So they're not just doing voter ID, they're also going out instructing people, you must number every box, etc. But it doesn't really happen. I mean, informal voting for the Senate's around 10%. That's quite high, but it was quite high before compulsory voting, and it stays around 4 or 5% for the House of Representatives. So, yeah, it's quite reasonable fear that you're going to get a lot of informality, and it doesn't happen.
So is informal voting still the same to this very day? I mean, is it just that 4 or 5%, the House of Reps, and 10% for the Senate that still continues to fail to work it out? I mean, it is hard. I get it. It's hard.
It's less for the Senate, but, yeah, you do think from memory it's a bit less for the House now as well. You do still have that element of informal voting.
Tell me, Chris, the difference between male and female voters. Prior to compulsory voting being introduced, did you see more men than women voting? I mean, obviously you see many more men seeking political representation, and political parties tended not to campaign directly to women and to seek the female vote really until the 1940s with the establishment of the Liberal Party and Robert Menzies really running that very strong female-focused campaign around the home and family issues and children and the like. So what was it like prior and then after for women with voting?
A lot of these worries and strategic concerns that parties have in the 20s about informality, about people in the suburbs who aren't particularly engaged and who aren't going to hear about the election unless someone drives past their house with a loudspeaker. A lot of this is particularly about women voters. Probably the biggest anti-informality drive in the 20s is organised by the Australian Women's National League in Victoria. They're this technically independent but really adjunct to the Nationalist Party. They're very concerned about informality. There's this association between the new vote of the compulsory voter, if you will, and the woman voter.
But you don't think that was well grounded in facts in the end?
In the case of informality, no, because that didn't increase radically. In the case of the suburban voter, it's harder to tell. There's not a lot of data on this that you can draw on and say, yes, men were more engaged than women in the 30s, or no, they weren't. This was the perception.
We've talked about using amplifiers for persuading people, or at least engaging with the people who were shut up in their suburban houses. And I think, is it Frederick Eggleston, Liberal Party politician, he talks about the self-contained man who didn't attend the public meetings and didn't engage, but you got through to him with the amplified voice. But what about things like door knocking and letterboxing? These are tried and true political campaign techniques. Letterboxing probably has become a bit of a dying art as people check their letterboxes less and less and less, and more their email inboxes.
I'll confess there, I'm terrible at checking my mail, so yes to that.
It's amazing how many letterboxes you walk past these days that are just stuffed with mail that the resident is obviously ignoring, probably purposefully.
Letterboxing does become more important in the 30s and 40s as a complement to this more persuasive approach and this greater emphasis on candidates. So this is when you get the pamphlet with a nice photo with the candidate on the front, a map of the constituency on the back, and some nice words about their background and policies in the middle. This is when this emerges as the standard. And yeah, part of the reason for that is to complement this persuasive approach, but it's also just now they don't have to do things like hiring 100 cars for election day. Local campaigns have more money to spend on printing.
And printing was really expensive back then. It was quite a significant cost for a political campaign. So if you didn't have to spend money on, as you say, on the cars, you had these funds raised to deploy for expensive things like printing. That opened up massive opportunities to flood people with pamphlets and candidate profiles and maps of the electorate.
In the 30s, 40s, 50s, printing was often the main budget item for local campaigns. So there'd be a central state party office. They would take care of things like radio advertising, advertising in the big daily newspapers. And then local campaigns would be left with things like maybe a bit of petrol to help the candidate get around. Yep, the main expense was often producing pamphlets.
In the 1940s, we're seeing this candidate-focused literature. Is that because it was seen as an easier way to persuade if there was a face to the campaign, that you could personalise it, localise it, it's a local candidate? So we have this free enterprise policy or a child endowment policy or a state control policy, nationalisation policy. But the face of this political party here locally is the one that's talking to you about these policies, rather than just a detached political message that isn't connected to someone you can go and meet and talk to about.
Name to a face, that is what this persuasive approach that grew up in the 30s and 40s was more or less institutionalised by the 60s. That's what this was about. Not particularly engaged suburban voters. They weren't going to go to a public meeting, but ideally they were going to meet the candidate at their door, and they were going to get a pamphlet in the letterbox telling them a bit about the candidate and their party. Nice photo on the front, and these were going to reinforce each other and persuade them to vote for that person. That was the essence of this approach.
And with the rise of radio as well, but this idea of political advertising on radio and on newspapers, when did that start to become quite common as a political campaign technique?
A certain kind of advertising had been around since the 19th century. That was mostly a little fig in the classifieds saying, so-and-so candidate, speak at town hall at 8 p.m. on this date. Display advertising starts to come in the 20s, and you start to see advertising agencies becoming involved in the late 20s, 30s. So again, campaigning there is getting more visual.
The advent of television in the 1950s had a dramatic impact on Australian society and culture in so many ways. But the way that political parties adopted that to their benefits is really interesting. And I know that, anecdotally said that Robert Menzies didn't actually enjoy TV as a medium. He'd much preferred radio broadcasts and print and found it quite an adjustment. Whereas you think of, say, Gough Whitlam in the 70s, he was really embracing the ad campaigns and the glitz and glamour around that and songs that go with it and the branding and the It's Time T-shirts and the like. They're quite iconic images from the past, aren't they?
These innovations taken together, they were an earlier version of that same shift to the visual that we saw with TV after the 70s. It's obviously not quite the same. TV tended to particularly serve party leaders, whereas in the 20s, 30s, 40s, it was much more about the local candidate. But there are definite parallels.
So would you say the advent of TV then lends itself more to what is called a presidential style campaign, where it's a leader-led campaign rather than a candidate-focused campaign?
Absolutely. Even now, it's quite hard to imagine something like Kevin 07 or It's Time in 1972 being particularly successful in 2024, and it would have been even harder to imagine something like that working in 1924. I mean, people knew who the leaders were, people knew more or less what they looked like. Even before radio, people had a sense of what they sounded like because journalists were good at capturing that sort of detail. But the leader wasn't going to come to your door. That was the local candidate.
Do you think that election techniques today, campaign techniques today, still are shaped by compulsory voting when you look at the experiences in other countries?
In a way, we've come full circle. In a way, we're back to voter ID. But you do still see the impact of compulsory voting in what parties don't do. We don't do get out the vote, even if it's a by-election where turnout may actually be very low. It's not something parties do a lot of. That Australian election day where people stand outside polling booths giving out how to vote cards and you have the sausage sizzle inside, that is, at least in part, I think, a product of compulsory voting.
Yes, that it's a community event that everyone's involved in. There is that sense of we're all in this together, whatever your political beliefs or whether you don't care at all, you at least get a sausage out of it. And even a vegan one if that's your preference.
It's not a huge hustle at 3 p.m. to get out everyone who hasn't voted yet, which it absolutely was in the 1910s. People can have their arguments, but there's not that routine rush to get out the vote.
No. Fascinating discussion, Chris, and thank you so much for revealing what it was like pre-compulsory voting and, of course, subsequent to compulsory voting on the hustings for political parties and their candidates. It's been great to hear all of this.
Thank you again for having me on.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.